International Monetary Fund says global economic growth will slow this year. The IMF now projects a 3.6% GDP rate for the global economy. That is down from 6.1% in 2021. The report cites Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying the war could further increase inflation, risk, and, of course, uncertainty. For more on this, I'm joined by Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas. He's the chief economist for the International Monetary Fund. Thank you so much for being with us, Pierre. We really appreciate it. It's fascinating to read these reports that say that Ukraine's economy, by the way, is expected to contract by 35% this year, also saying that Russia's GDP will fall by 8.5%. Can you put these numbers into perspective for people? How much is this war truly costing both sides at this point?
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, the war is having a very large effect on the global economy as a whole. But of course, the impact is very concentrated on Ukraine first because of all the physical destruction and the exodus of its people and the destruction of infrastructure. And also Russia because of the sanctions that have been imposed by a number of countries on that country. And to put things in perspective, the reduction in output by 8.5%, it's a very severe reduction in economic activity. And what's important to realize is that we are not anticipating a bounce back here. This is a reset of the baseline for the Russian economy. The impact on the global economy beyond that is also significant, but of course, a much smaller number than the one I just mentioned.
Well, I know one thing we're talking about a lot of here is inflation. And you write that inflation has become a clear and present danger for many countries. In the U.S. alone, the IMF predicts the inflation rate will reach 7.7% this year. Can you explain the dangers of inflation? Besides, most of us are going to the grocery store and other places to buy things, and we're seeing prices go up. But can you describe for people what inflation really means in our day-to-day life?
Well, inflation is what you just described, and we see the price of the things that we purchase for, our day-to-day life going up over time. And as in the current situation right now, even in the U.S. with a fairly tight labor market, wages are not keeping up. So people are seeing their purchasing power being eroded. And it's not just that prices are rising, it's that prices are rising in ways that create a lot of uncertainty about the future. People are realizing that somehow this erosion in their purchasing power is impoverishing them, and it's leading them to sort of ask for some increase in their wage or to try to protect themselves. In poor countries, the increase in energy and food prices, which is behind a lot of the increase we've seen recently, also creates very severe hardship. So there's clearly a need to bring inflation under control. Some of it is due to these things that are happening outside. The war in Russia and Ukraine is pushing up energy prices. But some of it is also due to the aftermath of the pandemic. Some of it is also due to the strong state of the economy coming into this. And central banks have a responsibility to temper this increase in prices over time and bring it back to a reasonable target in advanced economies around 2% a year.
It's been so confusing to keep up with everything because, as you said, before the war, the global economy was already seeing the impacts of the pandemic. You have the supply chain issues. You have, businesses as things are coming back online, not able to hire enough workers. Now we're talking about inflation. You see today that Netflix lost 200,000 subscribers as they're announcing a price increase. And you have to wonder if people are just making choices now as to what they're willing to spend their money on, what they're not willing to spend their money on at this point. It seems like we're kind of doing this yo-yo back and forth. When do you see the global economy potentially recovering from all this?
Well, the war, in a sense, is a crisis upon a crisis. We're just coming out from the pandemic, especially in advanced economies. Poor countries were still quite far behind, but advanced economies were rebounding. There was an expectation that we would be back on the pre-pandemic trend by, sometime in 2022 or even by the end of 2021. And the war has sort of pushed things back. For advanced economies, what we're anticipating is that this would push things back maybe by 1 year or two. But for emerging market and poorer countries, what we're seeing is they were already not catching up. The pandemic had a permanent effect on them, much more permanent than in advanced economies. And the war is certainly not going to help close that gap.
You know, I lived during the 2007, 2008 housing crisis. I was living in Florida at the time, watched that unfold in front of me. And very quickly, you know, local governments, state governments, federal governments all started trying to figure out how to quickly come to the rescue of that. Is there anything right now, with how back and forth we've seen things, can nations be doing anything to ease these economic stressors, or do we just have to let some of this play out?
No, there are things that can be done. So first, central banks on one side have to address the inflation problem. That may require tightening monetary policy, increasing policy rates. But on the fiscal side, there's certainly a need to protect, in particular, vulnerable populations, low-income households that have been hit really hard by increase in energy and food prices. I mean, this is important in rich countries like the US or European economies or the UK, and it's even more important in low-income countries. So governments have a responsibility here to try to cushion some of the blow, because some of this increase in prices can really cause very severe hardship. We're seeing in some countries the emergence of potentially situations of food insecurity. We are starting to see some protests, some food protests in some countries. For instance, in Peru, which is quite far from Russia and Ukraine, but somehow the increase in food and energy price is rippling around the world and is affecting many, many economies far from Europe. So clearly, governments need to come in and do something. Some governments have the capacity to do that. Others may need to obtain some external assistance, financial assistance from institutions like the International Monetary Fund or other organizations in order to bridge the funding gap that they are facing right now.
So glad there are smart people like you to figure this out. Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.